So now that you have thought about national identity and your own relationship to it, I want to introduce you to the theory of imagined communities, which was developed by Benedict Anderson. As we work through this theory, think about how you responded to the questions and how they might apply. Anderson was a political scientist and historian from Ireland who primarily focused on his research on Southeast Asia. He was Professor Emeritus of International Studies, Government, and Asian Studies at Cornell University until his death in 2015. And in 1983, Anderson did some important theoretical work around nation formation and national consciousness. And he had these central questions. What exactly is a nation? Why does the academic community struggle so much in defining what a nation is? How do people come to identify with a particular nation? And why is that national identity so strong that people are willing to kill and die for it? His study of these questions culminated in his book, Imagined Communities. And in this book, he argues the following. First, that nations are social constructs. They are not naturally occurring, but produced and reproduced by society. And further, he argues that they are imagined political communities, imagined as both inherently limited and inherently sovereign. In other words, national identity is the formation of an imagined political community that one shares with other members of a nation. That concept of nation is always limited, in other words, has finite boundaries, and it is always imagined as having an independent government. And Anderson identified 4 elements of a nation. That they were imagined as limited, imagined as sovereign, and imagined as community. And I want to go through each of these elements a little bit more. Again, the first element was that a nation is imagined. Most members of a nation will never actually know each other. The map on the right is of the United States, but this can really be applied to any country. Think of the number of people who consider the United States or England or Bangladesh or China their home. Anderson's theory was that part of the construction of nation included imagining some connection to each other based on a sort of shared citizenship. However, that connection is imagined because most people will never lay eyes on each other, let alone know each other. The second element of a nation is that it is imagined as limited. What this means is that no matter how large it is, a nation will always have finite boundaries. In other words, any nation has constructed borders. It has established lines of where one nation ends and the other begins. And those borders might be figurative lines drawn through the land, or they might be something like a river to establish a boundary. The photo on the right is of what is often called the triple frontier, the borders between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil in South America. Similar to our global migration lecture, if you had to look at this photo without the labels, you might interpret this photo as a border. You might not interpret this photo as a border between 3 countries. While it may seem like a quote-unquote natural boundary because it is a body of water that separates these bodies of land, it is people, not nature, that said one piece of land is one country and the other piece of land is another country. So you can think of the word imagined as constructed. The third element of a nation is that it is constructed as sovereign. So this includes a separation of church and state, and a concept of a centralized and independent government. In other words, a nation is not governed by another nation, but it governs itself without interference from other nations or the church. However, even though a nation might be imagined that way, it is important to understand this third element in the context of globalization. Think back to week 2 and our work on the historical legacy of colonization. Many countries in the global south, even though they are no longer formally under colonial rule, are still being exploited to the benefit of their former colonizer. So even though a country might be formally self-governed, this does not necessarily mean that there is no outside influence. And another thing to keep in mind is that this third element is establishing a connection between a nation and governance, or a nation and the state. If a nation is imagined, then you really can't say that there is a common, uniform cultural identity. Some within a nation might think there is a common, uniform culture, but that is hardly the case. So there is going to be a form of governance. So if there's going to be a form of governance around some definition of nation, then measures need to be taken to construct uniformity across people. And this leads us into the final element of a nation. Nations are imagined as community. And what this means is that communities are imagined as comradeship, as partnership, even though there might be very real and visible inequality and exploitation. And that inequality, that exploitation, is deliberate. The photo on the right is of a favela in Brazil. Favelas are impoverished communities that developed as a result of Brazil's housing crisis. The housing crisis is so stark that these communities often form right next to expensive developments like the one you see here. And as a result, they are often targets for real estate developers who want to cash in on that land, which displaces them and further intensifies the housing crisis. Favela residents also become the labor that will work in those expensive developments. Both the real estate developers and the people living in the favelas might identify as Brazilian, and there may be some sense of shared identity around that. However, as this photo really illustrates, the disparity between the rich and the poor cannot be ignored. Everyone might be able to call themselves citizens, but they are certainly not all being awarded equal rights as citizens. So these are the elements of the nation that Anderson identifies in his book. Now I would like you to pause this lecture and complete exercise 5.2 on imagined communities. Reflect on your answers to exercise 5.2. Many students at this point start to wonder where their understanding of nation comes from. They start thinking a little bit more critically about how they're positioned, not only within the nation state they call home, but how their nation is positioned on a global scale. National identity might seem like a highly subjective, abstract thing. However, Benedict Anderson identified an interesting source for the origins of national consciousness: the printing press. And this is because the printing press changed our relationship to language. When the printing press emerged and it became possible to mass-produce text more rapidly than before, written language became more accessible to the masses. And this was a very important invention in that regard. It helped increase literacy rates, for example, and helped loosen the church's influence on the state since people could now read the Bible for themselves. What it also contributed to, however, was the de-diversification of language. Language, again, is a system of shared meaning that, like any cultural practice, is fluid. It is always shifting and changing. It changes all the time through generations and across time and space. And what results is a multitude of languages that take many different forms. So there isn't really an English so much as there are Englishes. There isn't Spanish so much as there are Spanishes. People within one country, state, or even city can speak the same language quite differently, to the point that a person from Quebec, Canada, who speaks French would not be able to understand the French of someone from a Cajun community in the southern United States, or even understand a person from France. Language, then, is at its core diverse. When the printing press emerged, this began to change because it now became possible to bureaucratize language. It became possible to formalize language. So legal documents, for example, would typically only be available in the formal language. People who wanted to access those documents realized that their language needed to more closely resemble the formal language so that they could have access to those things. As this occurred, language became less diverse. And that formalization of language both set the stage for the development of a national consciousness and also helped advance the imperialist projects of Western countries. When you can formalize a language and treat one form of it as the norm or the standard, it becomes possible to systematize it and privilege it. There is, in fact, a strong link between loss of language diversity and imperialism, because it is typically the most exploited populations who must change their language. The graph above is data from a study conducted by the World Wildlife Federation, which studied the impacts of deforestation on language diversity. And what they found is that places with high levels of deforestation also experienced high losses of language diversity. And this happens through the development of the working class needed to do the labor of deforestation. So for example, an indigenous person might travel to a larger urban center for work in this industry. They get there and one of two things happen. Either no one knows their language, so they have to learn a new one, or there might be specific policies against using their indigenous language in their workplace. So either way, they stop using their primary language, which will carry on for generations as they have children who will also not know their indigenous language. And when language becomes formalized, it becomes possible to stratify language. It becomes possible to say, like, this is the correct way to speak, this is the incorrect way to speak. So while it may be tempting for some to think of language loss as something unifying, think of what is lost when a language dies. It's more than just a system of words and sounds. Nation formation and the resulting loss of language diversity can have devastating impacts. With that said, it is common for students to ask me whether it is bad to have an affinity or love for your home country. They sometimes ask if this means it's a problem to say something like, "I am Venezuelan." And my answer is always no. There's nothing wrong with loving your home and having some sense of cultural pride. That's not really what nationalism is. Where it becomes a problem is when differences are erased and exploitation is hidden in the interest of unity. It becomes a problem when nations are formed as a way to unite people against other people. And it becomes a problem when one nation is positioned as superior to another for the purpose of expansion. Simply loving your home country is not doing any of these things. But it is still important to think about how a nation state is formed, at whose expense, and how your positioning is influencing your sense of national identity. So as we transition into next week, be thinking about how nation formation and the development of a national consciousness contributes to the ways in which we rank and stratify language. We will explore the links between language, identity, and power, language and the politics of belonging, and the formalization of language and the historical legacy of colonization. And this completes our lecture. As always, let me know if you have any questions about the content. Thank you.